My name is Ishan, and I am presenting this talk about performing due diligence as Android engineers. I'm also a Google developer expert for Android and a senior software engineer at Tinder. So let's start with a bit of an introduction today. What is this talk about? In a nutshell, this talk is about things that you should consider when integrating a new library or an SDK, a third-party one, into your Android apps. Why am I giving this talk? Having worked on multiple projects that involved integrations with third-party vendors, I gathered a lot of learnings and came up with a framework that I wanted to share with y'all and also have it as a reference for my future self so that in future, when I'm doing such integrations, I can save time. I can prevent frustration along the way for myself and my colleagues. And let's discuss the agenda of the talk. What am I going to talk and what am I going to cover today? We'll briefly discuss what due diligence actually means. Then you'll find out why actually you should care about it for your teams and yourself. Then we'll talk about how can you actually perform due diligence without driving yourself crazy. Next, I'll describe broad categories that you can actually divide the whole due diligence process into. After that, we'll actually deep dive into each category and see how you can see each of those in depth. And in the end, I'll leave you with two questions that you have to answer on a case-by-case basis, depending on what SDK or integration you're trying to perform. So what is due diligence? Due diligence with respect to third-party SDKs is the investigation or exercise of care that is a reasonable business or developer is normally expected to take before entering into an agreement or contract with another party with a certain standard of care. Now, that's what a lawyer would define it to be. I describe it as an insurance policy for a third-party integration that I'm about to make. Why should you care about it? If you love your business, your customers, and your fellow developers, you'd want to be as cautious as you can when integrating with new libraries. This is to avoid any harm to the quality of your app, developer satisfaction, and most importantly, the business and the product itself. Think of it like a visit to the dentist. Nobody really likes it, but we all know how necessary that is for us. Now, in my personal experience, each team and person has their own way of analyzing things and looking at things. In this talk, I've tried to include most of the things that I believe could go wrong when bringing in a new library into your Android projects. However, I would like to give a disclaimer that this is not an exhaustive list. So let's do an overview of the categories with the framework that I've come up with. This broad classification will also help you split up the responsibilities amongst multiple team members when you're trying to evaluate an integration of an SDK. The first one is documentation. Second category is integration. Third one is customization. Fourth is security. Fifth is performance. The first and foremost thing that you'd want to evaluate is the documentation about the SDK itself. Now, this can be further classified into 5 different topics: licensing structure, installation and usage, pitfalls, level of detail, frequency of updates. So what is licensing structure with respect to libraries? Now, it is most relevant for open source projects. For an open source library, an open source license allows you to freely use, modify, and share the software that it is attached to. Now, you might have seen different types of licenses on GitHub repositories. For example, the MIT license or the Apache license, which is mentioned at the bottom. What it essentially says, the MIT license, do whatever you want with this, just don't sue me. The Apache license says, do whatever you want with this, just don't sue me, but just that it says it in many more words like a typical lawyer would. While this might not happen very often, certain open source projects don't really like different license structures. An example of that is, if you want your project to be incubated under the Apache Software Foundation, you cannot have a hard dependency on any project or library which does not use the Apache license. Now, in the installation and usage step of the documentation process, you will try to assess how are you going to install the library in your app, and also how are you going to actually use it. Is it always called on demand, like an image loader, or do you need to initialize it as soon as the app starts? For example, a logger. Does it require you to use the app context, or can you get away by using the activity context? The next thing that you want to look at are the pitfalls. Now, here you'll be scanning for special notes and gotchas that the library developer might have left for you so that you don't end up shooting yourself in the foot. For example, if a library needs to access a camera permission and it won't work without it, it might be a hard dependency that you cannot just launch with. Or a library might have a hard dependency on some sort of a push notification service. All of these things must be known before you actually start working with it. Also, if you don't find these kind of things mentioned in the documentation, but you discover this later at a process when you're actually trying to integrate it, this is kind of a red flag for your integration that you're about to do, because there are a lot of hidden things that the developer did not mention, and in future, this could actually break your app. The next thing is the level of detail. And here you should look at if the documentation shows you code snippets. Do they show you various scenarios? What kind of documentation actually exists out there with respect to this library? Are there blog posts? Are there Java docs or Kotlin docs? Or are there videos that you can just refer? And then this also directly impacts the velocity with which you can actually get this SDK to start working with your app. The reason being, if the documentation is not detailed, you might struggle to find answers to your questions. And good luck if the owner or the consultation for this library is actually happening from another continent or another time zone, which means your developers, if they're trying to ask a question or find an answer, they'll have to wait for hours and hours before the other team gets online. Next one in the documentation process is the frequency of updates. Now, this is another crucial thing to assess. How often do the owners actually update the documentation? And I repeat, the documentation itself and not just the library, because the updates to library can happen like at a very high speed. However, people don't really give enough love to the documentation and take this for granted. Now, this can be very crucial for your business. If the documentation is not updated at least with every major release, you are signing up for trouble. And how soon are the breaking API changes communicated should also be checked in this step of your process. The next is the integration part. And in this point, you'll actually start diving into the code itself, either in a separate project or a POC that you're trying to do to assess the library, or directly integrating it into your project and seeing how does it fare with your project. And this can be further divided into 7 steps. First one being consumption and delivery. Second one being the dependencies. Then the minimum SDK requirements, permissions, initialization, error handling and logging, ProGuard configuration. So what is consumption and delivery with respect to the integration? Consumption and delivery here refers to the mechanism of pulling in the dependency into your project. Is it a jar file? Is it an Android archive? Is it something that you'll have to drop into your libs folder, or can you get it from a central repository like Maven Central or JCenter? Now, this is also important because if these libraries are not served through a central repository, you might want to just copy them into an internal Artifactory and serve it from there. This is also going to help you maintain a backup of all the versions that you're actually integrating into the app, because if the original developer who's distributing this library decides to only expose the latest version outside and you ever want to roll back, then good luck, you have no access to it if you're not copying those things into your own, some sort of an Artifactory. At the very lower level, if you're not having access to an Artifactory, if you don't have a big project, just copy them into a Google Drive or Dropbox, but have a backup of these artifacts if possible. Then the next thing is the dependencies, and dependencies here refer to the dependencies that this third-party library in turn brings with itself. The impact it might have on your project is that you might have to update certain libraries which will break or which could break other parts of your app. For example, if someone builds a library on top of Compose that gives you an access to a widget that you don't want to reinvent yourself, and if it has a hard dependency on certain version of Compose, but your app is not using that, then you have to upgrade Compose throughout the and make sure that no breaking changes are happening throughout the app. So this is a good time to check if this library has a hard dependency on any of the other third-party dependencies that your project also uses. And if you can minimize the dependency surface, please try to do that. A good example is at times, for example, for a Kotlin multi-platform project, a developer who's building this integration or third-party library, they tend to give you certain artifacts which are only per platform, so you don't pull in everything into your project. You can only get to use what you're trying to use for your projects and not bring in all the other things as a part of that integration. The next is the minimum SDK requirement. If you've been writing Android for even a year or even 6 months, you know that there is a min SDK that you need to declare in your manifest, which tells the Android that the app can only run and compile against a certain version. And certain times it can happen that the app has a min SDK requirement, and if your app is not up to that mark, or you want to support users that are also at a lower level SDK, then this could be a deal breaker. And this is something that you want to find out pretty early on in the process and not by the time you've already decided that you want to use that library. This is not going to happen very often nowadays. However, it's something that you should still not skip at all. The next thing are the permissions. Certain libraries will require you to access hardware permissions or some permissions that need explicit user approval and are not just granted as soon as you install the app. And if your app does not already have those permissions given to you by the user, it might actually be a bigger change than just integrating the library, because when you launch that flow or something that uses that thing, you have to explicitly trigger a dialog asking the user for that permission. This could in turn scare the users from giving you that permission if they don't really understand why actually are you asking for that. So an important thing here to consider would be how are you going to introduce those things to your users? And this would involve a lot of brainstorming and iteration with your designers and your product people. The next thing that we need to look at is the initialization process of the library. Now, you would have already assessed this at a higher level in the documentation phase, but now it is the time to put it in practice and see if the initialization actually happens as the doc suggests or not. Do you have to do anything special, any workarounds to make it work? This is now the time to find that out. The next thing is error handling and logging. Here you have to assess how errors and warnings are actually logged. What is the granularity of the information that you have access to? For example, if something goes wrong in a library and it just crashes and you have no logs to debug, then you're kind of stuck with a library that's not telling you anything, and you have no way to change things because you're not able to debug it without actually going into the source if you have access to it. And you also have to make sure that none of those logs, if they're actually logging, are logged in production by any way of means. The next thing to consider is the integration part of ProGuard. Some SDKs might want you to add and modify the ProGuard config and ProGuard rules, as you may know. Now, changing ProGuard files sometimes can cause problems when you're trying to build release APKs. So make sure to double check things don't break in release builds. Just because the integration is working fine when you integrated the app and built it in the debug mode does not always mean that the app will work as expected in the release build, especially when ProGuard is involved. Now, the next broad category is the customization itself. Now that you've integrated the SDK, it's time to see what level of customization can you achieve with this library. And this is mostly in terms of the user interface. This is trying to please your designers, your customers, and also making sure your branding across the app, that is across the flow that this new SDK brings, if at all, is not broken. And this can now be further divided into 5 topics. First one being localization, accessibility, UI configurability, UX configurability, and dark mode compatibility. The first thing that we're looking at is the localization, and this relates to the ability to localize your apps. If the SDK has a UI, you must know if you can use translations in your app, if your app actually targets people in different countries and different languages. Does it support right to left languages? If not, is there a way to override the strings somehow to manually handle localization on your end? If your app is actually working and supporting 43 different countries and you bring in a new SDK, which only works, let's say, in English, then all the other users are going to have a bad experience. This is a time to check if localization with the SDK is possible or not. Next thing, again, is accessibility. And now this relates to the ability to make your apps more accessible so that more set of users can actually use your app, especially those with certain types of disabilities. Again, if your app handles accessibility. And if this SDK has UI, then it becomes even more important to check for accessibility. And if they don't handle it directly, is there a way for you to talk to the developer to somehow allow you to do accessibility just for your app if needed? The next thing is the UI configurability, and this refers to the customization at the individual component level. For example, does the SDK allow you to change button colors, text font sizes, or even a different font? It really depends on what the SDK is actually bringing in. And for apps that actually have a lot of users and it's big on branding, it becomes really important for you to understand if you can actually use your brand colors, your brand font with the SDK itself. So this level of customization should actually be an expectation that you have. And if it doesn't offer that, again, try to reach out to the developer, try to see if there is some way for you to actually make it work. Probably work with them to allow customization in future, if not at that very moment. The next part is user experience customization. And this is mostly for SDKs that allow you to launch something even bigger than a screen itself. An example of this would be photo editing or video editing SDKs if you're not building those things by yourself, or verification SDKs, right? If you're not building those experiences by yourself and just trying to rely on a third-party vendor, then essentially you're going to launch the whole thing, let the user do its thing, and then get an output or a result back into your app through either an activity or some way or the other. And then it becomes a process of asking yourself, what all can I customize from this? Do all the users need to go through all the steps to actually use this? Or can we actually cut short it just to suit our needs? Do you get sufficient callbacks throughout the process when that flow is actually happening so that you can understand if this SDK is actually what you need? Are there any bottlenecks within the process? Are people dropping out of your app from this SDK rather than from your app itself? This is a good step to actually start checking those things. The last thing in customization is actually the dark mode compatibility. I wouldn't have added this as a separate step, but I actually ended up finding out one of the integrations that I did in an app. When we turned on the dark mode, it just looked pretty nasty because the SDK itself did not handle that thing. However, our app perfectly supported the dark mode, and it just looked really weird. And imagine if at night some user is in the blanket trying to use your app to do whatever, and suddenly they go into that screen, which is completely bright, does not handle dark mode at all. It's going to be a really bad user experience. User might even uninstall the app. So you want to avoid that and want to make sure that dark mode compatibility to some extent is there. If not, then at least in your app, you should be handling that case that if the user is actually using the app within low light or under a dark mode, then when that thing is going to be launched, then you are not going to scare the user out. So you probably want to hide that UX from the user. The next step would be security, and this refers to the security aspects of the product with this SDK in general, which can now be further divided into 6 topics. The first one being data collection, data storage, data communication, data encryption, tracking, PII collection, storage, and communication. So what is data collection? Data collection could be anything that this SDK tries to capture. It does not have to be a user's input, but even something that the SDK itself is trying to understand when it is launched or used anywhere in the app. How does it impact you? They might be collecting things that you are not aware of and your users are not aware of. And you might want to be very cautious about integrating those things. At least having an insight on what this SDK is actually collecting is better than having no insight. In future, you can actually list it down, and then whenever an audit happens, you at least have things handy that, oh, this is the information we're collecting as a part of this SDK, so that if something were to go wrong, you can actually pinpoint that this is happening because of this SDK. Then the next thing is the data storage. If they collect anything, are they storing something, either on the device or outside the device? And this could be on the disk, in memory, anywhere in shared preferences, or any place that's possible to store something on the device. And the next part is the data communication. If they're not storing something on the device itself, are they taking something out of the device onto their own servers to process it, right? And there are laws, like in Europe, you have the GDPR, in California, the CCPA, and various other legislations are coming up where governments demand that some of the data has to stay within that region, cannot go out. For example, in India, they don't want a lot of data flowing out, so you have to have a data center in the country, and these kind of things matter when you start integration with third-party vendors that are not actually having data centers there and moving the data out, so your app could actually be at a risk. The next thing is data encryption. So it doesn't matter if they're actually storing the data on the device or they're actually transporting it out of the device. Are they encrypting the data? Are they using proper transport methods? Are they using SSL, HTTPS, or not? These are the things that you have to understand at this step of the process. And again, how does this impact you? If they're transporting anything out of the device that you don't want people to see, you want to make sure that everything is encrypted. The next thing is tracking. Now, this is really important because as a third-party SDK vendor or developer, there is no real way for me to understand, apart from talking to the developers themselves, how my SDK is performing. But if I want immediate understanding of how the SDK performs in big apps or with real users, the quickest way for me would be to add some sort of tracking that I can do at my own level. Rather than going through the company itself, because you might not share the data with them. So people, developers, companies, they sneak in certain types of trackers, analytical, marketing, functional, whatever, and then try to be smart and track certain things and then tell you, oh, we're just doing it for performance reasons. Even if they're doing it for performance reasons, it is your responsibility to make sure that you know about each and everything that is being tracked, and if any sort of tracking happens for marketing or analytical purposes, apart from the functional, you have to give a user an option to opt out of that marketing, because your user might not consent to that thing. And if you're not doing that, then again, you're at risk from the legal standpoint of view in certain countries and regions all over the world. The last step in this process is the PII handling, and PII refers to personally identifiable information. A PIN code from an address may not be something that could be considered PII, but when I start adding more data next to it, then I can actually start narrowing down my search and identify users personally. And that's what you don't want your SDKs to be doing. If they're doing it for any reason, you have to know that. You have to make sure everything is encrypted, everything is hashed, and there is no way for an actual user, or if a data breach were to happen, for any malicious intent actor to be able to decipher that, and then you're facing lawsuits for something that you actually didn't have control over. And the last part of this would be the performance of the SDK and the integration. And this can actually further be divided into 7 topics. The first one being build, the APK or the bundle size if you're using app bundles, startup time, memory and disk usage, networking, battery, And lastly, the user interface itself. So performance of the build in relation to the SDK integration refers to the fact that if at all, this integration is going to impact your build times, right? Now, how can an SDK integration impact your build time? Well, it can if you're using annotation processors. For example, if you're to include KAPT or any sort of annotation processor that a third-party SDK requires, then this is going to negatively affect your build times, and your build team or build engineers are not going to be happy about it. So whenever you're trying to see that, make sure that there is a way out to not use the annotation processor. If at all you have to use an annotation processor, it will be good to get that thing audited and profiled by your build team so that you're not going to worsen the developer experience for all the other engineers on your team. This is especially important if your project has a lot of modules or has a lot of engineers working and constantly pushing code for your apps. The next thing is the APK or the app bundle size. Certain types of SDKs will be bringing in, let's say, native libraries or a lot of assets and stuff like that. This is especially true when you're trying to work with videos, when you're trying to work with images, some sort of ML models that people might be using on device itself. And when doing that sort of an integration with your app, you're essentially just bumping up the size of your app without actually knowing. That could be actually harmful. So in one of the Google I/Os, I believe it was in 2019, in one of the talks, it was mentioned that about a megabyte increase in your app size can actually decrease the install rate by 3%. This could be really, really big if you're trying to target countries that don't really have high-end devices. For example, a lot of people in Southeast Asia or Africa, they still don't have access to the devices that have really high RAM or disk space. And there, when they're trying to find an alternative for an app to use, and if your app is much larger, has a much larger footprint, they might go to your competitor. So this is an important consideration when you're trying to use the SDKs in terms of disk usage, the APK and app bundle size. The next one is the startup time performance when the SDK gets integrated. So based on how the SDK is initialized, either at the app startup time or on demand lazily, for example, a lot of analytics SDKs or deep link handling SDKs, they want to do their tracking as soon as the user starts the app. And they want to hook into your process, get as much information transported to their servers. But at what cost? The cost is your app startup time starts to get longer and longer. And your user technically never wants to wait to be able to perform an action. Doesn't matter if an animation is running. If the user cannot actually perform an action, then it's kind of cumbersome and the performance is not considered good. So when you hook that SDK into your app, try to understand if it is possible to defer the initialization. If yes, to what extent? If it is not possible to defer the initialization, can you actually offload it from the main thread itself? And if those things are not possible, then you might want to consider an alternative. And this should be a really important consideration, especially if your app relies on something that happens really often. If a user is coming into your app multiple times a day, you don't want them to wait because otherwise the attention span already is decreasing for users. Everybody's fighting for their attention. And you want to make sure you don't lose that attention and the user can get to the content that they actually came to see really quickly. The next thing is performance in terms of the memory and disk usage. For SDKs that require a lot of memory or data-heavy things or the operations on the app, this assessment is kind of relevant. Are they using any sort of cache, either in memory or disk? Does it compete with any of the existing cache that some other libraries that are using? So this again becomes highly relevant in terms of image loading or like video editing or like video player apps. And even if they're using a cache, that's still not a problem, but that's not just the only thing that they should be doing. Are they purging the cache correctly? Because you don't want to have a library which promises you that we're going to cache everything offline, but we don't really care about deleting any data. And then when the user runs out of memory on the device, they're looking at, oh, what apps are actually consuming the memory? And if your app shows up on top, then your app is the first one that's going to get kicked out of the device and you don't really want that. The next thing is network performance. So if the SDK is communicating with any sort of a network, you have to check how does the SDK use networking? Is it efficient or not? How often does it make network calls? How much data does it upload on average, and how much does it download on average? And again, does it use secure communication or not? Then, in terms of battery, again, not a lot of SDKs will give you this information, and it's also not always relevant for this. But most of the SDKs will not have a direct impact on the battery. However, you cannot rule that thing out. For example, if you're trying to build an app that actually allows you to do something with location services, right? And if you're trying to recognize the activity of the user or at any given point of time where they are, you want to show it on the map, and the SDK is constantly pinging the location service, then that's not a good thing. Um, you want to figure out if the SDK has an impact on the battery. Is it waking up the radio very often? Is it using a lot of wake locks? And these kind of things are not really directly visible. You can use Battery Historian to find that out, but for most cases, it is very hard to pinpoint an SDK itself unless you already have baseline profiled for the battery of the app before you actually do the integration. And now, since Android has support, at least on certain flavors of it, for flagging apps that drain a lot of battery, this could actually negatively affect your app. So keep an eye on that thing. If a lot of users are complaining about the battery being drained too often or too much, did it happen after a certain SDK was introduced? If yes, then you might want to get rid of that or at least do something about it. The next thing that we're going to look at here is the user interface performance. Now, this is very different from the customization part. Here, what you're trying to see, if the user interface was provided by the SDK, does it perform at 60 FPS? Are there any scrolling janks? Or does the UI actually draw the frames within 16 milliseconds that the Android team wants you to actually do? And if it does cause any sort of jankiness or it's not smooth, then again, it could leave a bad review for you on the Play Store, might even degrade the performance or the perception of your app within your user community. And now, finally, the two questions to ponder over that you have to think about on a case-to-case basis. The first one is, can you leverage dynamic delivery when you're trying to integrate a new SDK? And an example that I can give here is, for example, you're trying to build a verification feature for your users, right? But once the user is verified, they technically will never use the whole verification process ever again. This is with a disclaimer that, sure, they can delete the account, make it again, or they can uninstall the app and then delete the account and then make it again. But for the most part, if they're not going to use the verification process again, and you're using an SDK for that, is it possible to actually dynamically deliver the SDK, especially if it has a footprint on the APK size? And then once the verification is done, can you actually uninstall that feature? Or another example is, some apps might try to bring in a different feature like filters. If you have an app that allows you to actually edit the images and then apply filters on it, any sort of transform, and then save it, post it on different social media apps, your users might not be needing all the filters or all the possible customizations that you can do to the image. Can you download these things on demand and not bloat the device? However, with this thing, the problem is, because dynamic delivery right now only works with Google Play services, then the devices that don't have the Google Play services, you cannot really leverage that. So that's why it has to be assessed on a very case-by-case basis. And you can't just apply it to any and every integration that you're trying to do. The next thing is, can you prevent tight coupling on the SDK itself? The reason for this would be, if tomorrow you decide or you find out that there exists another SDK which promises to deliver better performance at a lower cost, if you're tightly coupled with the alternative SDK itself, then you can't really bring that thing into your app. But you can prepare yourself to try out either through an A/B test or through a POC or something without having a hard dependency on an SDK. So when you see the SDK, find out what the surface area is that you have to use with that SDK. build out an interface and hide the implementation, and the app does not know how this actually is done. It just knows about the interface. And tomorrow, if you want to try out a new SDK, you just have to have another implementation and swap it. And that way, if you want to kick the other SDK out, the app again does not have to know. None of the features have to know how is this being handled or how is this being done. And you can do those swaps really, really easily without turning yourself crazy. And with that, I think I'd like to end the talk. If you have any questions, feel free to tweet them out or email them to me. You can scan this QR code. It gives you a personal email address. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot them to me right now. Multiple, but I would not want to give out any names. So let me try to anonymize my response here. So we did want to integrate a library which allowed users to provide consent and stuff at one of the projects. And we didn't want to build the whole consent management dashboard or whatever that existed out there. So we went to a vendor and we tried their solution, but it turns out, even though the vendor claimed that they have a lot of things already figured out, it turns out we were kind of their alpha users, right? And a lot of things in the library were done poorly, async tasks all over in the code itself, and pretty bad handling of the way the data comes in. Also, the data models that we needed to communicate were all over the place. That kind of raised a lot of red flags. However, that did not prevent us from bringing the library in. But, and this is the part that this due diligence process helps you, if you list all of your findings in a document, this thing goes under the section which is called the risks. And if you know something is wrong, but you still want to go ahead and use that thing, just list it down as a risk so that the management, the leadership, and whosoever is at the top making that decision with the vendor is aware of those risks. Probably negotiate in a contract that this is a risk for our project right now. Maybe 6 months down the line, if your team can help support, migrate things or make it better, then it'll be better for us. But I haven't had an experience where we outright rejected something. Because we are using libraries for a reason, since we don't want to reinvent the wheel, those things will go under the risks. And we will make sure we either follow up with the vendor itself, or we just are aware that, yeah, this is a shortcoming of the library, but we need it. However, we want to make sure that this doesn't break the app itself. So it does often play out a role whenever you ask developers, okay, why this library itself? And a lot of developers start the conversation by saying, this library has a lot of stars on GitHub, or it is by this particular developer who's very well known in the community, right? I kind of look at that thing with, and again, being the devil's advocate here, just because a library has a lot of stars or it is done by someone who's really reputed in the community does not mean it's the best thing out there. The reason for that is maybe tomorrow that developer is tired of open source development and they decide that I'm not going to maintain it anymore. Then you're hung up, right? So, and this is especially true for open source projects. When you're dealing with vendors or third-party libraries, there you're going to have SLAs and contracts in place that, oh, we are going to constantly deliver updates, or if you have feature requests, we can probably look at that based on our contract. But when you're solely relying on an open source project, you have to make sure that that project is at least being maintained. If not by the developer, then you start looking at how many pull requests are actually opened versus how many are being closed. How often are people reporting issues? How are the actual owners of the library responding to people, right? Because there could be an open source developer who just developed something, and now when people start asking for feature requests or report bugs, they're like, sure, I don't have the capacity. If you want to do it yourself, right? So those are the things you actually have to look at when trying to decide if, and again, not naming any developer or any company here, but there have been times where projects have just been abandoned, right? And you don't want to end up with an abandoned library, because then suddenly, if that library is deprecated or abandoned, if your code relies heavily on that, you've accrued a lot of tech debt for no reason, without doing anything, right? So all of those things have to come into play. And if you see, if something seems fishy to you, definitely worth it putting it in a risk that you're bringing in. it might never have a problem with your project, but having that as a risk, you've actually made sure, because what if you're not in the company anymore and you move on? And then the next developer that's trying to see what's going on with the library has no clue why did the previous developers actually add it. So that's how we've played it at my previous company in the current workplace. Um, Never really had to drop the integration completely, but made sure that the risks were highlighted and kind of acceptable for us. You had a question, I'll take yours. You had a question?
I was just curious if you used
I haven't personally used dynamic delivery in my app. However, I do know Reddit recently shared a blog post about using dynamic delivery, I think in production. So it would be really nice if you want to read out their experience. Personally, for me, why I haven't been able to use it, even though I want to, is because of the reason that if Google Play services are not available, then what happens to those users? And at the moment, we just haven't thought about investing so much time and effort into dynamic delivery for a certain set of users. So the question is, how do we identify if the SDK is actually doing any sort of marketing analytics tracking, not just functional? Even if it is functional, are we aware, or how do we find out? If the library is open source, you can just dig into the code, and it's relatively easy to do that. However, when you're doing it with third-party vendors, almost all the time, all of these vendors will actually have some sort of technical salespeople that will be talking to you or your developers, right? Even if they don't have that, when you're negotiating the contract, this is a question that you can pose simply to them, and they will have to answer. Obviously, if they're hiding something, then that's something that is not under your control. But bringing this up, you can try to understand and ask them point blank, what all tracking does your SDK do, and at what point, and why is it needed? Because there are certain ISO certifications and compliances that you might, or your company might be needing. There you actually need to tell the auditor what all data you collect or what all tracking do you do, right? Especially in Europe, this is very much prevalent nowadays. So anything and everything that you're using, you have to know and tell your users, hey, we're tracking this. Now, obviously, you're not going to say X library is tracking this data, Y is tracking this data, because your user does not really care, right? So it's your responsibility to gather all the tracking insights and then present it to your user and ask them, do you consent? If they say yes, you let that thing run. If they say no, then you find an alternative, because that thing cannot run. So the only way to find out is to ask the company directly, what all tracking do you do? And is it analytical for marketing or functional? Is there a way for us to stop those tracking if the user is not consenting? Email threads are best. Slack, again, it really depends on what kind of policies that your company might have, right? Emails are usually the best for these cases because you can easily CC people. There's a record there, and then you can share it with people, because Slack conversations can get lost really easily. Emails are the best thing that I find out, and then just use them whenever I need to either hand it over. So if you wanna onboard a new person to your project, you don't have to scramble through the messages in Slack. You just CC them on the email thread, and then they have the whole history available to themselves. Okay, and I guess that's all. And thank you very much.